This is an Adobe Photoshop video tutorial that explains tonal range and the difference between levels and curves. While each of these topics is technically different, they each work with the same basic principles, so I thought it would be helpful to understand them if I covered them all at the same time. Before you seriously get started working on raw files, you need to understand tonal range and how the different sliders affect different aspects of the image. From left to right, we have 100% black. Next comes 75% gray, which is also referred to as the 3/4 tone. In the middle, we have 50% gray. Next, we have a 25% gray, which is also referred to as a quarter tone. And lastly, on the far right, we have 0%, which is absolute white. The shades of gray from absolute black to absolute white are referred to as the tonal range. The number of different steps of shades of gray that go from the far left to the far right are determined by the image's bit depth. So if you have an 8-bit image, you will have 256 shades of gray. Now, it is possible to see this in the final image, which is why professional retouchers work in 16-bit mode. 16-bit can handle more than 65,000 shades of gray, which means you won't actually see the banding when it goes from black to white. Now, with that said, let's move on to levels. Now, if I introduce this gradient, as you can see, once again, it goes from black to white. If you look at this levels adjustment layer, once again, you see that we have a little black arrow representing the 100% black. We also have a gray arrow in the middle, which represents the 50% gray, and then we have the white arrow that represents the 0% white. I'm just going to quickly show you how this works. If I click on this black point and I slide it inward, you can see that that black starts taking dominance over the entire image. And you can see how we're crunched in the corner here, and we're crunched in the corner here. If I bring it back, it goes back to where it was. The same way, if I grab the white and I pull it over to the other side, once again we're crunched in the corner here, and we're crunched in the corner here. And if I grab the grays in the middle and I slide it this way, the gray slides over so that there's very little black, and if I go this way, there's very little white. And for those being curious, we have a secondary bar down here where if I slide the black this way, the image goes gray. And if I slide the white this way, once again, that side goes gray. So, when you are making an actual adjustment, let's say 55 and 220, you can see that we've pulled the black in this way and the white in this way. Effectively, it's created contrast within this gradient because we have more black, more white, and a gray in the middle. We've compressed the tonal range. Now let me introduce curves. Now think about this one in the exact same way. We have absolute black here, and instead of going left to right, like we did inside of levels, we're going at a slant. Okay, you can see the same histogram in the background. Okay, the difference is the line is coming at a slant. Once again, we have absolute black on the left, and we have absolute white on the right. And we have 50% gray right in the middle. Now, curves works very similar to the levels. However, the levels worked on a slider from left to right. Curves work on a slider from up to down and left to right. If I grab the whites, the same thing. One of the differences in the curves, theoretically, is that with levels, we have a black, we have a gray, and we have a white. However, curves introduce the 3/4 tone, or 75%, as well as 25% quarter tone. For example, if I make a point right here, and I tell it that the input is going to be 65 and the output is 25, and I do that at the 3/4 point, and then at the quarter point, I tell it that the input is going to be 190 and the output is at 220. This is called an S-curve. We've lightened the lights and we've darkened the darks. However, as you can see, it looks very much like the levels does. In fact, it looks very much like the levels does, which is actually why when I teach my students about levels and curves, I explain to them that it's pretty much the exact same thing. And until they're ready to introduce curves into their life, there's no reason that they can't just work with levels. And I'm going to take this just one step further, and I'm going to introduce an image. If I take this image here, and I drop it into the levels, and I put it underneath the level adjustment, we can see that it's added the contrast to this image, where the darks got much darker and the whites became a little bit brighter. I'm going to take this image and again drop that into the curves. And I'll put it underneath the curves adjustment layer again. And now you can see that both the curves and the levels look all but identical. In fact, they're arguably identical. Now, I might not have the actual math correct with the way that this slider is going here and the way this curve is going here. However, I've gone in here and I've really looked at these two images and they are identical. However, when it comes to retouching, the thought of grabbing the absolute whites and pulling it in makes me a little bit uneasy because I feel like I'm blowing out more inside of the image, and I'm much happier grabbing the 3/4 tones and the quarter tones and creating contrast this way. However, I've just proven that they look all but the same. Now I want to show you one more thing that might make your raw processing feel a little bit more intuitive. If I drop this raw image into Photoshop, it's going to open up inside of Camera Raw. You'll notice that all these sliders run right down the middle. Now, very much like that tonal range that you've been looking at, blacks represents the absolute black. So if I slide this over here, the image gets darker based off of the darkest points. If I grab the shadows, this acts more like the 3/4 tone, or 75%, and you can see it darkens it just a little bit more. If I were to grab the highlights, you'll see that it starts grabbing some of the lighter areas, which would theoretically be represented by the quarter tone, or 25%, and then the whites would finish up with absolute white, which only affects this little bit right here. Now, unless I'm mistaken, the 50% point needs to be adjusted with the exposure, and I can bring this up to around here. And strangely enough, by bringing up the exposure and completely darkening the entire image, this actually doesn't look that bad. But anyway, this is my attempt to explain how these different sliders are affecting the image, as well as how curves and levels are, rather than being different, they're extremely similar, and how they affect not only the images that they are adjusting, but also the tonal range within the image. If you found this video tutorial helpful, please go to www.theartofretouching.com, where you can find more tips and tricks to make you a better photo retoucher.